Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula is rugged, a 60-mile finger of volcanically formed rock that formed over 1 billion years ago. As the continent rifted apart, Lake Superior's basin formed, with massive stone shelves collapsing inward, forming the peninsula and Isle Royale. A glacier filled the basin, and rivers continue the job today. The geology is unique, especially when it comes to the nearly pure copper found near the surface, running in deep veins over 1 mile into the earth. Native Americans used this metal to form tools, pounding the copper into fishhooks, spears, and jewelry. Stories of massive copper boulders reached European explorers. The first sailing vessel on Lake Superior was built to reach the copper riches rumored at the western end of the lake. French Captain Louis de Léron sailed home with 500 pounds of copper in the hold of his ship. In 1771, the British attempted the first commercial mine, but the output wouldn't lead the world until nearly a century later. It was Lake Superior Copper Company that dug the first productive mine, and by 1852, the first rock crusher was delivered at Cliff Mine south of Eagle River, Michigan.
Most of it went between about 1860 and really 1900, 1910. There was a period where they were shipping out ingots out of the Keweenaw waterway, and you see a lot of postcards of that, of the big copper ingots going on the steamships. And that had been going on for a long time. Obviously, the Pewabic came out of here and was lost off of Alpena in 1865. And there were a lot of other copper vessels that came out, but none that wrecked.
Every penny in America between 1850 and 1865 contained copper from the Keweenaw, until the government worried there was too much dependence on this ore and mandated other sources. But with the invention of electricity and the telegraph, the demand for copper wire kept the Keweenaw in business for over a century.
These were big cities. You could go from, really South Range all the way up to Mohawk and not leave, industrial complex. Now, it's been largely gobbled up by woods, by forest. You wouldn't know this was here. It looks like we're in the middle of the forest.
Towns like Freda, Central, and Centennial all but vanished, and mines and mills were slowly dismantled. Here at Point Mills, the boilers were taken out in 1929. The walls and roof were scrapped in the early 1940s, leaving a concrete floor with railroad tracks and cement pedestals that looked like rows of tombstones in a ghost town.
This was a multi-level stamp mill. They'd stamp the rock up there because it was pure solid copper, not ore. They had to bust the rock off of it. They'd come down to the next level where they'd wash it, and they'd take it down to another level where they would smelt it, and then they'd take it down to the dock there and ship it out on Great Lakes steamers.
Crude stamp mills pulverized rocks blasted from the mines, and the discharge after sifting still contained millions of pounds of copper. A special dredge was built to suck the sand from the 100-foot-deep Torch Lake to process tailings and reclaim discarded copper. In 1929, it was claimed that the stamp sands often had more copper than the ore coming out of the mines. The dredges were adapted for continuous operation, even when upper Michigan temperatures dropped well below zero. Sprayers on the sides of the dredge kept the water from freezing, as a 55-inch impeller drove water and anything else on the bottom up through a 20-inch pipe via pontoons in an elevated pipeline. That line, which extended up to 1 mile, also carried 2,300 volts from the shore to operate the dredge. On January 15, 1956, the pump stopped working on dredge number 1. The leaking hull soon filled with water, and the dredge settled atop an underwater hill of stamp sand.
The deep one, the one that sunk out there in 40 feet of water, is now a hazard. When I was a kid, the roof just broke the surface, so you'd know not to run into it with your boat. Now it's below water and the roof is gone, but it is the darkest, creepiest dive I ever did. 40 feet down amidst those beams, and there's just huge fish, big bass sitting around in there and big pike up near the surface, and you get so dark at the bottom you can't see your hand in front of your face.
The mine purchased another dredge that was built in Milwaukee in 1943, renaming it Quincy Dredge number 2. It pulled millions of tons of sand from the lake, resulting in about 4 to 10 pounds of copper for every ton of sand removed.
This is the pilot house of Quincy Dredge number 2. This is where she's been lying since 1968. She was laid up here about 10 years before that in the late 1950s after they stopped dredging works, and eventually she sank here and scuttled because the pumps that were keeping her afloat stopped working.
In January of 1968, Calumet and Hecla announced their reclamation plant was no longer profitable, and 50 employees at the smelter were laid off. The dredges remain as monuments to an industry that gave the copper country its name, but little remains on the barge despite being named a historic place.
But this is interesting. There's still some big electric motors in there. There's still some a lot of machinery, a lot of piping, and obviously the control set here that was used to raise and lower that giant dredge up there that could go down over 150, over into 100 feet of water. So really an amazing site that's still preserved up here to some extent. I think the graffiti paint is really mostly what's preserving the wood.
Strikes lasting over 100 days hit the last open mines in 1955 and 1965, and competition from strip mining eventually caused CNH to call it quits 3 years later.
The strikes and then the finding of copper out west and in Arizona and then in South America kind of finished it off, because here you have to bust this solid copper out of the rock. Down there it's just ore. You cook it and let it settle to the bottom. So I don't think there's much of a future for copper up here, really, because there's still so much cheaper copper elsewhere in the world.
Hi!
Oh my gosh, we're on the Keweenaw waterway.
This is pretty amazing.
By Houghton, and this is the wreck of the E.D. Holton. She's a wooden harbor tug built in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1875. Named after Mr. E.D. Holton, who was one of the movers and shakers and early businessmen of Wisconsin. He was the sheriff there, and he was on the board of lake underwriters for Milwaukee. He was a really prominent guy. Holton Street in Milwaukee is named after him. And the Holton Canal in the Menominee Valley was named after him, and this was his tug. This was a famous Milwaukee vessel.
This location is the former CNH dock, known for decades as the Tamarack Coal Dock. The former coal yard is now a private residence, but back in 1931 it was the site of a spectacular early morning fire that torched the tug Holton. In the murky waters of the waterway lie the burnt timbers of the Holton, which worked Lake Michigan for most of its life. It pulled many steamers and schooners free after gales, including the Ann Arbor Car Ferry, Waverly, Dunham, and Hanson. The brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, walked her deck in 1880. Tragically, 2 crewmen were lost from that same deck in 2 separate accidents, and Holton even worked the wrecked steamer Walter Frost off Manitou in 1903 before heading to the Keweenaw Peninsula in 1925.
She was brought up here and served basically as a tow vessel. She was last owned by one of the local pro hockey players, Pope DeMars, who was in the UP Hall of Fame. He had her moored off of the old Upper Peninsula Power Company docks, at that time the CNH coal dock, and she caught fire and sank.
Most of the material that couldn't burn is still here, the towing bits and even the large 2-cylinder high-pressure steam engine.
It's interesting because that steeple compound engine is there and the boiler's there, and that's some technology from 1875. Which is pretty early, pretty cool to see that still intact.
This is a close-up look at the compound steam engine used on a tug much like the Holton. I'm at Henry Ford Museum, and this is from Ford's lumber tug Daniel Hebert. Not only did it work hauling logs from Keweenaw in Canada, but it also helped save lives during shipwrecks, including the J.T. Hutchinson in 1903 and the L.C. Waldo in the Great Storm of 1913. The Waldo had hit bad weather as it approached Keweenaw, tearing the pilot house off the freighter.
They talk about this wave going over and taking the wheel out and the compass out, and that they had to obtain a compass from a lifeboat in the back and use that to steer by.
That compass was blamed for why the Waldo snagged on Gull Rock near the very end of the peninsula. A passing steamer got word to the lifesavers, but the closest station was Eagle Harbor, over 30 miles away. Keeper Charles Tucker and his crew attempted a rescue, but their 36-foot motor lifeboat was broken, so they took the smaller boat into the harbor and launched into Lake Superior's fury. Eyewitnesses couldn't believe they were heading out.
They were in the lighthouse, this family with the lightkeeper, and they said, "Better wire Washington, boys, those guys ain't never coming back." Because they saw them go out. Well, they got out of here and made it about almost to Copper Harbor. But Tucker was afraid because of the ice buildup in that, and they had a hard time. I don't know, they said I read something, an excerpt that they had a hard time keeping the engine going. He was afraid for his crew, so he turned around and came back. And then they said when they made it to shore, the townspeople had to break the ice off their jackets and stuff to get them, you know, and I believe, well, it happened with maybe Tucker and Glaze, the boat. They had to break the ice off his hands from the steering wheel.
By 3 in the morning, the larger boat was repaired and the team made the 32-mile run in 4 hours. They found the Portage life-saving station was already there, aided by a tow from the tug Daniel L. Hebert. Captain Thomas McCormick had arrived on site early but waited for dawn's light to approach the Waldo. Coated in thick ice, the lifesavers had to chop their way to the crew, who had all huddled in the forward end of the shipwreck. Lifesaver John Beck removed his shoes to navigate the slippery hull.
This guy volunteered to jump off to get a line to the ship. So he took his boots off and he had wool socks, and he knew when he hit that icy deck, his socks would stick to the deck, you know, a lot better with no boots on.
10 survivors climbed into the Portage boat, and the remaining 14, including 2 women, joined the Eagle Harbor crew. After 90 hours, they were down to just a can of tomatoes, and the warmth of the tug brought relief. 17 gold medals were awarded to Portage and Eagle Harbor for their heroism in the storm. Tony Glaza, a surfman with Eagle Harbor, was also a photographer who later snapped photos of all the stranded ships. He would advance to captain of the Eagle Harbor crew in time for another rescue in 1926.
Yeah, but look at how smooth it is over there.
Yeah,
That's
well,
almost
these are
beach
pretty
sand.
smooth now. Yeah, this is smoothed out pretty nice.
3 foot. 3 foot deep.
The stories of the L.C. Waldo and the city of Bangor are linked in many ways. Waldo slipped into the Saginaw River just 11 days before the city of Bangor, built by F.W. Wheeler in West Bay City in 1896. The 2 ships also collided after being stuck in the ice for 22 days in the St. Clair River in 1901. A quarter century later, they would both be snagged by the Keweenaw Peninsula, and their crews would be saved by the Eagle Harbor Lifesavers, which was now being led by Anthony Glaza, the photographer who would immortalize the vessels with his dramatic pictures of the shipwreck.
I think that's a piece of the city of Bangor, Rick.
Only pieces remain where the city of Bangor once towered above the shoreline. Lost in a blinding snowstorm on November 30th, 1926, the ship smashed into a big rock and was forever lost on Keweenaw Point, about 6.5 miles east of Copper Harbor. Oiler Harold Hartway remembers going aground in a telephone interview with Gareth McNabb.
Well, when we hit the rocks, at first, we didn't know where we was at, you know, and we asked for crew, we all gathered in the dining room, and some of them said we hit another ship, and some of them said we hit the beach and breakball and everything else, and nobody knew what was going on.
The Bangor had been recently converted into a car hauler. Nicholson Universal added an elevator in the middle of the ship to allow vehicles to be stored below deck. Lengthened in 1905 by 72 feet, the freighter made headlines when it carried 500 cars on her deck and in her belly. On her final trip, she had half that, but was carrying 3 other captains who were on their way home from Detroit to Duluth.
My room was on the starboard side, and when it rolled over to the port, I'd open the door and look out, see what was going on, and I could see a car or 2 going overboard every once in a while. So I made sure I closed that door when I rolled back to starboard again.
The crew tried to stay warm in the galley, but the stovepipe was blown down, and the choking smoke made them put out the fire. That morning they went ashore and started walking, but deep snow and a swamp forced them back towards the shipwreck.
You know, the irony's not lost on me that there's been several crews that have made this trek through the woods over the last several decades, and if not century. The Turret Chiefs crew made this voyage. The Ultadoc, 4 members of the Ultadoc, the most injured of the crew, decided to make a break for it, and they walked through these woods. And the interview that I heard from the banger was they built a fire not far from here and heard wolves coming.
Oh, they're wolves, yeah.
We all got off safely, and we started walking in the woods. We was in the woods pretty much all night. Built a fire, and could really hear the wolves howling around. When I got off, I had just a little axe in my hand, and I guess I was the only one who had an axe, and everybody wanted to chop wood that night. I think they wanted to chop wood because they heard the wolves.
The shoreline was nearly impossible to walk on. Deep snow, cliffs, and shifting rocks made each step miserable. Only the captains escaped the ship with their belongings, and it was expected the crew would carry the load.
So we had to put it down, and he insisted somebody carry it, and someone or other said, well, you're not in the boat now, Captain. So they left the clothes, and he couldn't carry it, so they just left him. And some of the fellas, they were getting blue in the face from the cold, walking and everything.
I mean, it's easy for us. We have cell phone service, but to think of being stranded here in knee-deep snow with no real heavy boots, I mean, some of them barefoot. Crazy.
This crew was not dressed. They had Oxford shoes on. They didn't have hats. Some didn't have gloves. They were using socks for gloves and, wrapping up every which way they could to, stay warm. And of course, it's probably 20 degrees outside, with a raging, snowstorm blowing off and on.
The lifesavers had received a phone call that the steamer Thomas Mayhem was stranded on Point Isabel, about 15 miles further around the point of the peninsula. On their return run with the crew of the Mayhem, they discovered the Banger and then its crew just down the beach. Glaza used a megaphone to shout to the survivors, telling them to build a big signal fire.
And told them to stay there, that he would come back to Copper Harbor after he dropped the Mayhem crew off. And when he got back, he picked up a lifeboat, a small rowboat from the range lightkeeper, and towed that back out to the scene, anchored the big motor lifeboat out in deeper water, and then got a line ashore, and then they used that to ferry the crew members off the shore.
All the seas were still running high at the time, but I never saw anybody in my life who could handle a Coast Guard boat like Captain Glaza could. He was right down in that trough of the sea all the time, and must have been 15, 20-foot seas there, and you think he was riding on calm waters. Every once in a while we'd hit a wave and shake us up a little bit, but 95% of the time right down in the trough of the sea. He was Superman for Coast Guard.
Glaza called for the doctor in Calumet, but knew he had to act quickly if he was going to save the survivors' feet from frostbite.
He got a big pan of ice cold water, had both my feet in it, and then he just gradually put in a cup at a time of hot water. About 4 hours going on like that till that water got a little warmer and warmer and warmer all the time. And starting from ice water to warm water is quite a long deal with a cup at a time. But I think that's what saved my toes. I haven't had any trouble since that.
Nicholson sent a watchman to keep an eye on the 230 cars that still remained aboard, and a salvage plan was devised to plow a road on the frozen lake to bring the cars to Copper Harbor. With a 12-foot hole in the stern of the Banger, it would have to be done before spring thaw.
When you look at some of the pictures in the museum up there, there's one car with the windows all blown out and it's solid ice inside. So they worked from, I think, January, February, March, 3 months, those salvagers, to get those cars off and got them to the shoreline.
A parade of cars were put ashore awaiting drivers, fuel, and batteries.
All the cars didn't have batteries. So they had to take the batteries out and put them on a horse-drawn sleigh. So they moved them in stages and then eventually drive them in, into the harbor.
Mark says the parade of Chryslers was led by the captain who rescued the Banger's crew.
I was told that Anthony Glaza, the keeper, drove the first car in. And if you look at the pictures, it might be him in that car with the Copper Harbor lighthouse in the background.
Later that spring, the convoy moved to Calumet, where the cars could be shipped by rail back to Detroit for repairs. Finding drivers wasn't too difficult when the pay was announced.
Aggie Isaacson told me, I think her mother drove one of the cars, back to Calumet, but they were paying them $5. And they said story was the late Mac Frimidig always said, yeah, there was many a high school boy skip school, just to drive a car, and earn $5, in its day. There's stories that 2 to 3 cars never made it to Calumet. Whether that's true, I don't know.
The wreck was soon abandoned after it was determined the ship couldn't be salvaged, but locals did find something interesting on the beach nearby.
They found that book under a log in the spring, because somebody from the ship, or probably the captain, had hidden it there so it wouldn't be destroyed, and that the last page was there originally, but it somehow disappeared.
The last page seemed to be dedicated to what cargo was on board, which has led to speculation on how many Chryslers were lost from the top deck during the storm.
I heard up to 18 went overboard. And that's the number. Whether there was 220 or 240 cars, of course, in the logbook, when you read that last page is missing on the logbook, and so you don't know what they did load.
Locking down the exact location of the Banger came from this aerial photo in 1938, which led to a search pattern for what might remain of the cargo.
Those cars are out there on the bottom. We know it. They could be 5 miles from shore, they could be 100 yards from shore. Well, not 100 yards, but they could be in 50 feet of water and probably, recognizable. And so we did that side scanning out there.
It's really hard to say with this sonar because this hasn't got very good resolution.
With the waves gradually building, only a rudimentary search was made, with a target that could be something of interest.
I think they'll be found. I really do. I think it's not a long matter of time. We drove the boat 7 miles from Copper Harbor to get there. It's not outside the realm of possibility that those cars are going to be found within the next 3-4 years.
Eagle Harbor's museum includes a Chrysler of the same vintage as the salvage cargo of the Banger, and the roof even has what appears to be an axe mark from being chopped from the ice.
All the lore says it came off the city of Bangor. There was a fella, Andrew Slazarczyk and John Slazarczyk. His nickname was Patty. They were 2 brothers. They both worked for the road commissions, either Houghton and Calumet road commissions. And in the year after the wreck, Andrew purchased the car from maybe Paul Pollard, the local Chrysler dealership. He purchased the car, and apparently he passed away a year later. Then his brother John, or Patty, purchased the car.
Chrysler used an early form of vehicle ID called a FEDCO number. This one is located on the dash. If decoded correctly, and if it's the original, it would be a year too late for the Banger shipment, a Chrysler 4-door sedan from 1928 called a 52, named for the speed it could obtain with its flat-top 4-cylinder engine. A scratched-out engine plate and what seems to be a replacement engine also makes identification difficult. The Banger was soon joined on the beach by another freighter, the steamer Altidoc, which also braved a fall gale and lost. 4 crewmen walked through the woods to get help in Copper Harbor. Glaza took the cutter Crawford to the wreck site to pull the remaining 21 crewmen off the ship, which was now burning because of a fire in the coal bunker. Crawford would also search for the Kamloops, lost with its entire crew off Isle Royal. At least 5 other ships were beached on Lake Superior, Huron, and Erie. Many of these ships would sail again, but the Ultadoc was left on the peninsula for salvage. The engine was removed that next year, and the ship was slowly dismantled over the next 2 decades. West Bay City's shipyard was so prolific that even the Ultadoc was built there, launched at F.W. Wheeler as the steamer Lakeshore in 1901.
I ran into a fellow by the name of Ken Lacoste. I think it was Ken Lacoste. His last name was Lacoste, and the other fellow might have been a Curtin or a LeBlanc. They were loggers in the 40s. And he said because the war effort and the need for metal, he said they gave up logging and they went out and started salvaging metal out there. And he was telling me stories that you'll find pieces of cement out there. And the cement is in the bottom of the ship, in between the ribbing and that. He said they would take old fire hose and pack that full of gunpowder. They would seal it, and then he said they would, one of the two would swim down and force it underneath wherever they could, and then light a fuse, blow it, and then they would go retrieve the metal.
Look at this piece, it looks like an I-beam.
Wow.
No telling how long this has been buried in this. I mean, the wreck was in 1926, and they tore it apart into 1943 and 44. So these pieces could have been left here. This could have been part of the salvage. This could have been part of the banger. I mean, I don't know how you'd ever be able to tell, but the dynamics of the high water levels have been revealing pieces that others haven't seen, and it's so remote here, likely it'll stay here.
I think so, Rick. And I mean, you look at where we are here, way out on the far northern shore of the Keweenaw Peninsula. It doesn't get more remote than this. When these guys wrecked out here, they knew they were in for an adventure.
I got one more treat for you too. Check this out. When the ship was built as a car carrier, it was too light because cars are not as heavy as iron ore. So they filled it full of concrete, and look at this piece.
Wow.
That is really cool. This is from the city of Bangor after it's lengthening, and it's just amazing to know that it's sitting right here.
They took an old truck, a little flatbed truck, and they re-welded the truck on a frame so it was, he said they could drive in 12 feet of water with this truck. And he said they would drive out, and then somebody would swim down either a rope or a chain or whatever. They'd hook what they could, and they'd drag it back ashore.
Brendan, we're walking the site now of where the city of Bangor came ashore, and we're seeing a lot of metal.
Yes, we are. It's pretty impressive what's left of this ship from 1927.
I mean, even with a scrapping, which, they tried to get every drop of metal they could from World War II, there's still a lot of stuff that's turning up.
It's amazing how the ice took this ship apart, what's left of the hull bed, and it was literally buried here on the shore by almost 100 years of storms and heavy rock just coming over it. Look at it under that tree.
This is by far the biggest piece we've found, and it's got rivets still on it. And it's just amazing to think that this was built in Bay City, Michigan, and these were hammered by the folks at the West Bay City shipyard. It's just amazing to know that the ship's gone, but this big piece still resides right here, and there's still vehicles out there someplace.
That's the reason I went. Not because we were going to find a car, right? I wanted to see those little pieces, and what's so amazing is you can actually pick up a piece and hold it in your hand, of the city of Bangor or of the Ultadoc, And it's sad, probably 10 years from now, that'll all be gone. Beachcombers will pick it all up, and they'll have their piece of the city of Bangor. Kind of like happened with the shipwrecks that were underwater in the 80s and 90s when we were diving, and everybody took a piece for their collection, and eventually Mom threw it out, because it was rusty and nasty. And I hate to say it, but that's probably what'll happen to a lot of that stuff on the beach there. But it is really cool to see it now while it's still there.
The remoteness of the Keweenaw area has left so much history to explore, from shipwrecks to old stamp mills, and even the life-saving station and lighthouses.
Well, it isn't surprising because we're up north and there's not that many people. They don't need to tear them down and put in a condominium.
Preservation of these unique structures has led to one of the Great Lakes' largest historical societies.
I think we have 11 museums and 8 different sites. But we just constantly building and doing things, and we remodeled the History Museum because it was the Coast Guard garage originally. Many volunteers. Always interested in the history of the Keweenaw.
Keweenaw's history and beautiful scenery is unique to the northernmost part of Michigan. To learn more about the shipwrecks here, visit shipwreckpodcast.com Or check out my DVDs on Shipwrecks of Lake Superior or Final Run, the story of the worst storms on the lakes. With historians Brendan Baylott and Mark Rowe, I'm Ric Mixter.